Special needs education is a topic most of us don't think about until a friend or a family member with a disability comes along and shows us its true importance. Fortunately, federal law mandates that special needs education has to be provided to students in need. However, is it enough? Specifically when it comes to children who have been placed on the autism spectrum.
We know from the research that children with autism would benefit tremendously from a very intensive set of services, primarily applied behavioral analysis, as well as other related services like speech and language therapy.
That's Mark Claypool, the CEO of ChanceLight Behavioral Health, Therapy, and Education, and author of the book, How Autism is Reshaping Special Education.
To try to squeeze those things in to the predefined 7-hour school day just doesn't work. It's just not practical. These kids need much more intensive services. They need easily 25 to 40 hours of service to really make the kind of difference that these interventions can make. And so that's just a structural limitation of the current system if we see it as a public education or special education issue only.
Claypool says that to understand the shortcoming of our public schools as a place that can educate children with autism to live their best lives requires us to understand the law that grants these children the right to an education. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, more commonly referred to as IDEA, which was formally enacted in 1975.
It is a law that was signed by President Gerald Ford in, I believe, 1977. It was, previous to that, was actually put out by Congress in 1975 as Public Law 96-142, I believe, or 94-142. It was changed to IDEA as a catchier name, I guess, before the president signed it. Sort of prophetically, President Ford, when he signed it, said, this is a great idea, but this is going to be very expensive and we don't know how we're going to pay for it. And so IDEA technically mandates that the federal government fund a very significant portion of special education. I believe it's around 40%. And that has never occurred. I think last time I checked, the federal government has paid roughly between 16 and 17% of the cost, which leaves the rest of the cost to states and primarily local public school districts. The law itself was built on the basis of civil rights law, and it was really put forth because public school districts before this time were excluding children, particularly in rural areas where services were not available. It was one thing if you lived in Boston or New York or San Francisco where services were prevalent, but if you lived in a town or a state where there simply were not great services available or any services available, the school district could simply say, you cannot bring your child to school. We don't have the tools or the services necessary to serve them. And so this law provided a mandate that says all children are entitled to a free and appropriate education regardless of their disability.
However, Claypool says the law was phrased in a way that was somewhat vague. It mandated schools to educate students no matter the severity of their disabilities, but no one was quite sure what it meant to fulfill a requirement to simply educate.
And that's what really led to the rather infamous Rowley decision in 1982, where the Supreme Court clarified that, in their opinion, school districts could not provide potential maximizing intervention.
The Rowley decision was a ruling that said a deaf student wasn't entitled to a sign language interpreter in school. In effect, the decision said schools weren't required to do everything in their power to service a student's disability, but rather just had to make a good faith effort that the common education for able students translated for a disabled student. Claypool says this is especially problematic for autistic students now that we know there are techniques that can make a huge impact.
When the law was contemplated, the vast majority of children that were in need of services were really intellectually disabled children. And frankly, these were somewhat static handicapping conditions. Children, nobody really expected, for lack of a better way to say this, nobody expected those children to be cured. If you roll forward then 30 years and you're looking at a situation like we are now with autism, or 40 years, we know, the research shows, the data shows clearly that if you intervene early with a child with autism, you have a very, very good chance of turning their life around dramatically. Children who are nonverbal can indeed learn to speak. They can learn to be independent. they will always have autism, but they can be much, much better equipped for independence in adulthood if services are provided early and with great intensity. And so the idea that simply providing access is enough, it just isn't enough, particularly if your child has autism.
So Claypool contends our schools don't do enough to help students with autism live up to their full potential. But Claypool is careful to explain that this shortcoming is not the fault of teachers.
In terms of the current program or the status quo, which I take to mean public special education, the greatest strength is always the teachers, the great, caring, professional teachers. They're there, and they want the best for their kids. They want the best for their classes, and they're held back really by the restrictions of the law and the funding, or lack of funding. So I think that's the great strength. Nobody gets into special education to earn a paycheck. Nobody gets into special education because they don't want to see children do their best. But they're trapped in a system that really prohibits that in many cases. I think the other great strength is the idea of access and equity, in that it is very inclusive. Everyone is entitled to be admitted, and that is a guaranteed right.
Still, Claypool says this is a system ripe for great change, and he says there are several factors driving these potential changes. First and foremost, he says autism education is rising to prominence because autism identification is on the rise.
One change that has certainly been huge and in the news is just the dominance of the news about autism and its increased occurrence and diagnoses. And so the CDC says now that 1 in 68 children is on the autism spectrum. And that is such a dramatic increase over the last 20 years. That increased number, it's cumulative, of course. So while we frequently think of children with autism as being very young, they are aging and matriculating through the system, even to adulthood now, in great numbers. And so this is something that is dominating special education from its earliest ages all the way through young adults.
With higher prevalence has come an opportunity for parents of children with autism-related disorders to drive the conversation on their own terms.
Parents of children with autism got very frustrated with the standard processes of getting services from a public school district under special education. And as a result, led by organizations like Autism Speaks, these parents formed advocacy groups in various states and to really reclassify autism as a healthcare issue rather than an education issue. One of the prominent speakers in our book, Lori Unum, who is a great advocate for children with autism, and her son has autism, and she has fought tooth and nail for his care for many, many years. She says, a school superintendent didn't diagnose my child, a doctor did. This is a healthcare issue, and that's really a very significant variable that is causing change.
Claypool says the system could be better served if it was a more streamlined version of what we have built into something of a nightmare of smokescreens and red tape.
We owe it to ourselves to take a hard look at the status quo, which is really very siloed and built into these bureaucracies. So there's education, and within education there's a whole other bureaucracy called special education, and those two things don't really work together that well sometimes. They don't talk, they don't coordinate well. Then there's healthcare, and healthcare doesn't really talk to educators, and we've actually made it even harder for that to ever happen with a lot of privacy laws that are well-intended but are creating, again, barriers to sharing information. Then even within healthcare, we have the separate entity of behavioral healthcare. And again, that's another kind of monumental silo. And then finally, I would say there's this other thing that happens, when a child reaches, in most states, the age of 21, they are excluded from school, and nobody knows what's going to happen to them. And so we have these bureaucracies around vocational training and vocational rehabilitation, which have been in place for many, many years as sort of a safety net, but they're terribly underfunded, and they are only able to help a tiny fraction of children who need support past 12th grade.
So while solutions to the problem of non-maximizing education for autistic students won't come easy or cheap, Claypool says they are worthwhile.
Special ed is kind of one-stop shopping. You take your child to school and you drop them off and you expect them to do everything for you, but it's not getting done just because there are too many things to do. And so that's just not satisfactory.
Of course, systemic change like the holistic education model Claypool dreams of never comes quick. In the meantime, Claypool says parents, unfortunately, have to fight tooth and nail for their child's best possible education. Luckily, there is help available.
As it relates to what parents can do, parents with children with autism, I think the most important thing they can do is to know their rights. So many parents do not understand their rights. It's very complicated. It is worth knowing. It's worth doing. There are all sorts of advocacy groups in every state that would be glad to support parents, particularly groups like Autism Speaks. And I think if parents had a firmer understanding of that, they'd be in so much better shape than just being at the mercy of different people who may not know the whole story about what's available.
You can read more about autism education in Mark Claypool's book, How Autism is Reshaping Special Education, available now. For more information about all of our guests, including a link to Chance Light Behavioral Health, Therapy, and Education's website, visit viewpointsonline.net. You can find archives of past programs there and on iTunes and Stitcher. Our show is written and produced by Evan Rook. Our executive producer is Reed Pence. Our studio production is done by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
There may be no car racing enthusiast quite like comedian, author, and podcaster Adam Carolla. He holds the Guinness Book of Records for the most downloaded podcasts and loves racing in one of his classic cars. Every time he takes the wheel, he seizes the opportunity to live a more exhilarating life. Now, Castrol Edge's Live on the Edge campaign shines a light on Carolla's unique character in its latest film short, Rain Starts Play.
For most people, rain stops play. For me, rain starts play. It's an opportunity, just as everything can be. It's my unceasing pursuit of fun and adventure to make my life more exhilarating. That's been the key to my success and happiness. I believe that life is exhilarating in everyday moments. Seize the opportunities. Don't run away.
Visit Castrol USA on YouTube to see Rain Starts Play, the latest Live on the Edge film featuring Adam Carolla. Take a look at how Adam seizes exhilaration in all that he does. Rain Starts Play on Castrol USA YouTube. Live on the Edge.
Individuals and businesses with tax problems, listen carefully. Do you feel like you're losing control of your finances? If you owe over $10,000 in back taxes or have unfiled tax returns, we can help you take back control. The IRS is the largest and most aggressive collection agency in the world, and they can seize your bank accounts, garnish your paycheck, close your business, and file criminal charges. Take control of your tax problem now by calling the experts at U.S. Tax Shield and take advantage of the Fresh Start program and new laws that may allow us to negotiate a settlement for the lowest amount possible. Our team of tax attorneys and enrolled agents can stop collections and get you protected so you can take control of your financial future. U.S. Tax Shield offers a price protection guaranteed quote to get you protected today. U.S. Tax Shield is A+ rated with the Better Business Bureau, so call now. 800-568-1647. That's 800-568-1647. U.S. Tax Shield. 800-568-1647.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook to learn about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on iTunes. Plus, you'll always find podcasts of our segments and information about our guests at viewpointsonline.net. Join us again next week for your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.